Thanks, Patrick. Thanks also to Eileen for inviting me. I normally do not speak to crowds that are politically active. So this is fascinating and I think quite important. I'm very sympathetic to much of what's said. I'm here to respond to Randall O'Toole's provocative title for my paper, or my talk, which is Green Buildings. Right? Does he say business sense or religious movement, right? This is a very interesting topic, maybe only because I've been spending, decades working on it. But it's interesting for a couple of reasons, and I just want to give you a quick idea of where I come to it. Mainly because it requires that interdisciplinary activity to really understand what's going on. First, I ended up getting a degree at the University of Chicago, a PhD, and I ended up being an academic, and I taught at architecture schools. So I taught the history of architecture, I taught the theory of architecture, and I taught graduate design studios. So I was an unfortunate triple threat to some students. One of the most interesting parts about that is, of course, I've spent my whole life being essentially obsessed with buildings and the built environment and all of the attributes that are involved there. And so eventually I left academia because they were unhappy with many of the things that I would say. So I left and I got a degree in law, and I practiced construction law for almost a decade. So I litigated. I was a transactional lawyer. I dealt with actually drafting the contracts that were involved, and one of the most interesting things about this conference is that there hasn't been a lot of discussion about the fact that infrastructure, P3s, buildings, all of these things are actually about the underlying contractual schemes. And so the overlay of the policy is irrelevant if you don't understand the underlying contractual schemes that are in play. I mean, one of the ways to do this, just in terms of both buildings that I'm going to be talking about and the infrastructure that we've been talking about otherwise, is to create what are called EPC contracts. No, that's okay. Oh, quite all right. And these have been around for probably 50 years, if not more. They're called engineer, procure, and construct. And all of these contracts are for infrastructure activity. When you're building a $400 million wastewater treatment plant, you use an EPC contract. When you put up a nuclear power plant, you use an EPC contract. Those EPC contracts are written in such a way that if the budget goes over what was agreed to, often the contractor pays the difference. And if the contractor comes in below the price, you share the savings with the contractor. And of course, because this is infrastructure or large-scale industrial or other types of activity, very, very high dollar values, and must be done on time and on budget to be able to allow that particular type of activity to take place properly in the stream of commerce, everybody knows you got to get it done on time. Otherwise, you will pay. And there are sureties and insurance entities and secondary carriers of this risk. It's a giant industry. This is very important to understand when you're talking about the underlying policy changes. And I didn't know I was going to talk about this, but I've been working for a long time on various very minor contractual changes that could take place in these documents to significantly increase the output and the performance. So that's a separate issue. But this applies directly to green buildings as well. And so let's just talk quickly about this. So I was a professor of architecture. I became an attorney. And eventually what I do now is I consult with businesses and do a lot of work in policy, but especially in sustainability and risk. Most of the people who talk about sustainability really don't understand that that type of what I'll describe here is an extraordinarily vague definition, generates all kinds of risks downstream, both contractually and non-contractually, both for governmental entities and non-governmental entities, especially because they have the sort of perverse incentive to interpret the documents in a way that's as broad or as narrow as necessary to acquire greater revenues. Right? So, having said that, I'll do something that looks like I'm looking at my notes that I actually did something with. So obviously many of you know this. You're wrestling with this right now. What is this thing called sustainability? Why are we even bothering talking about this? I mean, I always like to go to first principles. That's one of the things that I feel like is some small talent I might have. Maybe it's just because I was bludgeoned at graduate school so often. I feel like that's the only thing I gained out of it. But the first principle for sustainability would be, what the heck does it mean? And if you can't make it mean something, then I would argue, and the attorneys in the room will be sympathetic, I think, to this, is that virtually everything that deals with sustainability, I'm going to have a quote in a second here, but is void for vagueness. You sue for void for vagueness not because that particular language is vague, but because it creates massive incentives for arbitrary enforcement. This is the key problem in these areas. When you're talking about HUD, when you're talking about all of these different things, the dilemma is that you're able to create an arbitrary mechanism for enforcement against individuals or entities in a manner that would fulfill any definition you give it, given that the law is void for vagueness. Because you want to prevent the judiciary or the administrative apparatus from having the power, the coercive power of the state to interpret it in any way they see fit, or as Oliver Wendell Holmes used to say, depending on what they had for breakfast. Right? And so one of the key attributes of green buildings is that it trucks in this particular kind of void for vagueness language. The most interesting thing about sustainability is it's been a massive success. And why is that? Now let me give you a quick quote. Some of you may know this economist. His name is Robert Solow. He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And in 1991, he gave this little talk at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Research Institute. And I thought it was interesting to realize that it was already given in 1991, and if I can find it right offhand. He's talking about sustainability then. And even then, it had sort of infected economic lingo. And of course, it permanently infects the lingo about buildings and transportation now. It's motherhood, apple pie, and the virgin birth rolled into one, right? I mean, you can't question it. If you question it by definition, you must be part of the dark side, right? So I'm quoting from him, and I didn't realize Randall tells me that you can put up things on the website, and so I'll make sure I get the whole article. It's a brilliant article, actually. It says, to make something reasonable and useful out of the idea of sustainability, I think you have to try a different kind of definition. And I'm going to give you my own in a second. But the best thing I can think of is to say that it is an obligation to conduct ourselves so that we leave to the future the option of the capacity to be as well off as we are. It is not clear to me that one can be more precise than that. Sustainability is an injunction not to satisfy ourselves by impoverishing our successors. That sounds good too, but I want you to realize how problematic it is, how hard it is to make anything precise or checkable out of that thought. If we try to look far ahead, as presumably we ought to, if we are trying to obey the injunction to sustainability, we realize that the tastes, the preferences of future generations are something that we don't know about. This is a very crucial attribute. Much of the conversation that we've had here imagines that there's, whether from the private sector or the public sector, some magic person who has the capacity to predict what will the world look like in 50 years. Virtually all of the data shows you that that type of expert elicitation is in massive error. It is well below 50-50. Monkeys throwing darts are better than expert elicitation in what the world will look like in 50 years. Right? No, it's very, I mean, one of the things that's extraordinarily tempting to believe that because, I'm in my little silo that I have special powers. And I can see what the world is going to become. And all we have to do is look back to 1950 and imagine, would anybody in 1950 have guessed what we're doing now? And pick any of the good, bad, ugly, whatever you want to do. Chances of that are essentially zero. And of course, anybody who plays the stock market knows why this is the same problem. Right? If you know what the discount rate will be in 50 years, you don't need to worry about these other problems because you essentially make more money than anybody on the planet. You should be funding whole countries. Right? And then we should all be friends with whoever this guy is. Right? So, let me just go on to the a second example. I don't usually use this example because the people I normally talk to, as I said, freak out about some of the things that I say. But in this audience, I think this is an absolutely appropriate anecdote. Years ago, I wrote for the National Institute of Building Science the document that defined what a high-performance building was. And one of the things that we did was we had a number of committees, and those committees were broken up by aesthetics, sustainability, cost-effectiveness, energy, a whole series of things. There were 7 of them. ADA, those types of things. What would a real high-performance building look like that had, you know, the proper attributes? So we were sitting around, all the chairmen of the different committees, and I was to draft the document and so forth. And we had the woman from sustainability, and she was extremely high up at EPA for buildings. This was her job. She went around occupying this role at various. It's a good job if you can get it. I mean, you know, it's like you just say whatever, and nobody tells you anything. So, except at this particular meeting because I'm a jerk. But you know, because I'm supposed to write this document, I have to make sense of what's going on. We had all decided that the only way you could make sense of the idea of a high-performance building was that the building was an optimization problem, not a maximization problem. You have conflicting issues at play. Do you want to make it extremely energy efficient? But it's a DoD facility that requires massive amounts of energy. Do you want it to be, you know, aesthetically pleasing? But what's the cost of making it so aesthetically pleasing? One of the great examples is GSA's grand boondoggle for, it's called architectural excellence. Look it up. They build 100-year buildings and pay premier architects from all over the world huge monies to design these projects. Clearly it's not necessary, but because the GSA has taken on the theory that they represent what the future aesthetic value of the federal government will be, you should pay for that. And there's a wonderful guy who holds the job always, who's sort of a schmuck architect who's delighted to have moved up to this role where he plays with all the big players. He gets to give them money, so he's their friend, right? So one of the oddest parts about dealing with green buildings is that it involves peculiarities in law, it involves peculiarities in architecture, it involves peculiarity in economics, and of course it involves peculiarities in ethics. And one of the things that I'm particularly concerned with is ethics. And because I spent my whole life intersecting with the built environment, I'm always interested in how you think deeply and ethically about not only the problems that are associated with that, which is my particular bailiwick, but the way in which that has to necessarily involves larger scale policy, and of course, I mean, for those of us who have any concern with ethics, how we might lead our own lives. I mean, you know, some people aren't concerned with it, and that's okay, I suppose, as long as they don't injure me too much. But one of the key things about the green building environment is that it rests on a series of presuppositions which are both incoherent and are fundamentally unethical. First of all, sustainability is neither definable and is so vague as to be useless. And as Soloff says in another part of this article, it says that's the beauty of a lot of these ideas. That's the attractiveness of the idea, right? And so in a way, we're commiserating that why don't people listen to us more or something like that. Well, it's not because we don't have the right slogan. It's because we actually believe that knowing stuff is important. Right? And I don't mean right or left. Right? It's just crucial that you know things. 5 minutes, I knew this was going to happen. But so let me just do this. Okay, so we've talked about the ethics to some degree. Of course, I'm delighted to talk more about this. Lots of you, especially the trip that we took around Denver, should indicate to you that there's a permanent additional compliance cost and regulatory cost which is being borne by municipalities and governmental entities all the way from the federal government down to the very local for these types of green and sustainable initiatives. The most important thing to realize is they actually don't result in better performance. Interesting, that's the parallel to the transit conversation that we were having. You know, it's puppies and motherhood and apple pie and all of that, but it has absolutely no, there's no data to suggest any benefit. In fact, I'll leave you with one technical piece of data. Most of these green building programs use the Energy Star program from DOE as a benchmark to decide when something is better or something is worse. Well, the underlying algorithms for that have been analyzed by a very good friend of mine who's a physics professor, blah, blah, blah. But Oh, there we go. It tells me I've only got 5 minutes. So, who has made clear that all of those algorithms are completely incoherent. The difference between getting a 50, which is 50% of buildings are better and 50% of buildings are worse, and getting a 75, which gets you an Energy Star rating, is fully within the boundaries of uncertainty. So if you're a real estate developer and you're thinking that you're going to be able to demonstrate that you're a little better than that guy over there, the underlying algorithms are completely made up. And yet, the amount of money that Energy Star and DOE has spent on this is staggering. Right? So, I'm giving you that. But here's the other crucial sort of first principle issue to keep in mind. Virtually all of this work is based on a theory of the precautionary principle. When you combine sustainability and precautionary principle, you get a very bad outcome. Sustainability is sort of vague, right? Precautionary principle is incoherent. It's impossible to lead a life using the precautionary principle. You cannot have any policies which are based on the precautionary principle, because the precautionary principle says if there is the possibility of significant catastrophic harm, you will preemptively stop doing whatever it is without waiting for any scientific evidence to fulfill whether that is actually a problem or not. This is the basis of a lot of work now for USGBC and LEED. I can talk endlessly about that. I'm sorry I don't have time about that, but I'll put a lot of stuff on there on the site for you. They're using what's called a hazard-based analysis instead of a risk-based analysis to create red lists to force manufacturers to absorb massive compliance costs to decrease overall innovation. And I'll just give you one final example because I know I'm running out of time. I do a lot of consulting for certain types of industries that people don't like the chemical industry. And surprisingly, chemicals have a lot of benefits. But there's this funny thing, which is a whole bunch of architects have decided that they're going to force manufacturers to eliminate a whole series of red-listed materials. They pick these materials not for scientific reasons. They pick them because some group in Denmark has decided that they're going to use the precautionary principle to pick a bunch of chemicals that they hate. So what we've got at this point is a permanent mechanism by which the design sector, I haven't even talked about architects, which I was going to, but a permanent mechanism by which green buildings and the use of green building rating systems and the necessity to fulfill them force manufacturers to absorb compliance cost for these types of activities, because they believe they can't compete if they don't fulfill this kind of voluntary, fictional, higher rigorous notion of the chemical and its danger. I'll just give you one sort of hardcore example. I was at a meeting with probably 30 major folks in what's called the adhesive and sealants industry, and these are all chemical manufacturers of various types, and virtually everything you do in real life involves the adhesives and sealants world. And we were discussing how much the additional compliance cost would be, and a good estimate was for every SKU that they had as a manufacturer would be $60,000 to $100,000, and then would be repeated. Now you can imagine this is beautiful if you're a giant company looking to crush smaller companies. You are looking to crush innovation, which might compete with you. So, and I had this happen right in the room. I won't name the company, but they said, well, that's probably $5 or $10 million additional compliance. We could handle that. And then there's another company in there who's a small chemical company, does innovative stuff, and they're saying, we know there's a lot of people in the chemical industry who didn't even make a profit last year. You're going to put all those people out of business. And of course, the big guy isn't complaining. So remember that this particular area is deeply entrenched in Yandel's, Baptist, and bootleggers problem. Virtually everybody in this area of green buildings is a bootlegger. And then you've got the architects and a few small groups acting as the Baptists with the bully pulpit. So I'm getting the hook. I appreciate your time. I really do. And I'd love to talk more about this because a lot of things I've heard are very fascinating, especially the legal issues that are involved. I'm always fascinated with as well. Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.